What is going on? It is Dungeon Dad, also known as Josiah. I did that backwards, but you get the point. Today we're going to be doing another campaign diary. Bit of housekeeping up front. If you are one of my players, don't watch this video. You should know that by now, but I'm just telling you again just so you don't. I am going to be picking things up right where I left off in the last campaign diary video. So if you haven't watched that one or the one before that and you want to have some semblance of what's going on, I would recommend going to watch those. And if you don't care, or if you've already seen those videos, then let's get right to it. As is the norm with these videos, I won't be editing it down too much, so I expect it to run somewhat long, but we're almost caught up with where the characters actually are in the game itself, so we'll see. So when last we left off, I believe the characters had just returned to the Yawning Portal. They helped some elves out with their unicorn problems, or one of the unicorns anyways. They killed the Displacer Beast, that was fun. And they were basically on the road to liberate their orcish friends. Basically the orcs who they helped out in exchange for some blessings from their shaman who was now alive because of the Gulthias tree's fruit. Right, now I remember. So the first step was the orcish war chief wanted to have his Orog liberated. And his Orog was being held with a bunch of the other warrior orcs in a place called the Fallen God, which is basically a giant statue that collapsed who knows when. It was a statue to Helm at one point, like 1,000 years ago, and it had been around for a while, and right now is being used as kind of a fortress slash way station for the orcish tribes. So what ended up happening here is the party went with the orcs. They traveled through the desert for several days, and they made their way to this statue. Also, by the way, for those of you who don't know what an Orog is, it's basically just an orc, but better. They are technically still orcs, but they're bigger than orcs, they're stronger than orcs, they're smarter than orcs, they're basically just Orc 2.0. In many cases, they would probably just usurp the tribe for themselves because they are better in almost every way. But if you've read Volo's Guide to Monsters, which is the lore that I applied to my world when it comes to orcs, to some regard anyways, Orogs are kind of indoctrinated from birth to basically serve as like the right hand to a chief, and they don't want to rule themselves. They believe in their religion and society, Orogs are basically meant to serve as very valuable warriors and tacticians. And because of that, they're very dangerous. So it should be obvious why Goroth, the war chief, wanted to get his Orog back before assaulting the city to reclaim his rightful throne. So with all this in mind, the characters ventured off towards the Fallen God, which isn't an idea I came up with 100% on my own. This is actually a module that I purchased from the DM's Guild like a couple years ago to run as a one-shot and really enjoyed it. So I just took the layout of the dungeon and reflavored it. I believe the original module has Kenku in it, some Kenku thieves held up in this ancient fallen statue. Basically, I just placed it in the desert and changed it to orcs. I'll put a link to that in the description below. I don't remember exactly how much it is. I don't remember paying a whole lot of money for it, but it's a good little dungeon, so definitely recommend that. So anyways, they're traveling. This is the first time we're doing a lot of overland travel, so they do about 4 days of traveling through the desert. Fortunately, they have a crap ton of water with them and lots of rations. They were not messing around, so that's good. They also didn't roll any encounters on the way there. Unless they're in a very dangerous area or there's something specific else otherwise going on. The way I do encounters over the wilderness, like traveling throughout the land, is the party rolls a d12. A 12 is a difficult encounter, an 11 is a normal encounter. 10 is usually something happens, but it's not necessarily good or bad, or it just something happens. And 9 or less is just, it's an uneventful day of travel, basically. And they didn't roll anything, I believe, on the way there. Actually, that's not true. The day before they got to the statue, they had a tough encounter, which ended up being really funny. So what happened here is they encountered a group of ghosts. Also, coincidentally, as per the calendar I gave them, this happened to be a day where there was an eclipse. So we basically said that as the eclipse was happening, these ghosts kind of rose up out of the desert sands and attacked the party. Whew, just talking about ghosts made me cold. I had to go get a sweater. Also, it's almost December and I live in Canada, so what are you gonna do? I refuse to turn up the thermostat yet. But I digress. They fought some ghosts, ultimately defeated the ghosts. These ghosts, I describe them as being kind of nightly specters, meaning the ghosts of dead knights. A little backstory here. These ghosts were basically ghosts of an ancient battle that happened in the desert when it was not a desert in a time hundreds of years ago. Karen, the Genasi Ranger, was frightened by these ghosts as per their fear ability. And then she failed her save so horribly, she aged 40 years and became 70 years old. This was a little funny at first, but then when the players realized it didn't go away after they defeated all the ghosts, it got a little scary, and she was like, well, guess I'll die. So Karen turned into a decrepit old lady. I mean, 70 is still young enough to be able to do some things, but as an adventurer, that is not easy, especially as a ranger. Moving forward, they defeated the big boss ghost who seemed to be in charge of them, who actually dropped his armor when he died, because he was kind of animating that as a ghost, more or less. Also, that ghost possessed Karen, said some stuff in a language none of the players understood, and instead of just getting defeated with his ghostly brethren, left to the ethereal plane. At least that's the going theory right now. So after their ghostly encounter, the party decided to rest for the night, and they kind of were perched under a sand dune, like the sand dune was coming up, and they were just below it in the valley, where on the other side of that was this fallen god statue. They did spot some gnolls that night that were out on patrol, but nothing really came of that. The gnolls didn't attack them, they just kind of left, and the party just decided to let sleeping gnolls lie. And on they went down to the fallen god the next day. In there, they snuck in through a back way that the rogue, I believe, was able to find by sneaking around. They cleared out the hollowed out god statue of the orcs who lived there. And by orcs who lived there, I mean, of course, the forces of the usurper who were keeping prisoners, the prisoners being the Orog and some of the warriors belonging to Goroth. So that was great. Joyous reunion, but then things kind of turned sour when the Org was like, look, they have many of our people. We have to go now. They've taken them to the north. We don't know. And whenever they take people that way, they never come back. So they went to the north about 20 minutes. This wasn't a long trip. This all happened within the same day. And they found basically an executioner's block and some kind of summoning circle. They had orcs, basically they were chaining them to this giant rock, doing some kind of ritual that involved draining their blood. And there were just a bunch of orcish bodies around. Fairly gruesome sight. There was also a bunch of orcs that they'd just taken there, still chained up, and there was one orc chained to this giant stone slab. And of course, there were a bunch of the bad orcs on this kind of platform thing where the stone slab was, and they also had a Tanaruk with them. If you're not sure what that is, I'll put up a picture of it. It's from Volo's Guide to Monsters. It's basically what happens when you fuse a demon with an orc. And these guys are extremely nasty. They're basically superpowered orcs, and they get to make an attack every time they get hit by a melee attack, which is bonkers. So they do a crazy amount of damage. So I made the party fight this group of orcs and one Tanaruk. Now, basically what I planned here. If the orcish shaman who was on the platform managed to complete the ritual and kill this orc who is chained to the stone slab, a second Tanaruk would have been spawned from the orcish bodies. Or one of them anyways, and this blood sacrifice would have kind of fused into another Tanaruk, which is a very hard encounter. If they managed to save that orc before the horrible things happened to him, then they wouldn't have to fight a second Tanaruk. Makes sense. Obviously the players didn't know that, but I was kind of leaving it up to them to decide if they wanted to prioritize this orc's life, which fortunately they did. They stopped him from being executed. He almost died like a couple times through the battle, but they managed to prevent it. And fortunately, they only had to fight the one Tanaruk. And of course, they dealt with all the other orcs fairly easily. They had the chieftain Goroth and his direwolf with them, as well as the Orog at this point. It was a fairly large battle that took up most of the session when this happened. The Tanaruk, however, proved to be a very, very tough foe, which I knew going into it. If a second one had spawned, I still think they would have been successful in this encounter, but one of them probably would have died. Or at least one of the NPCs. In this case, Goroth almost went down, actually, but they managed to prevent that from happening as well. I think he had like 3 hit points or something by the time this battle was over. But long story short, they managed to overcome. One thing that the Paladin Feldin did that was very smart was he used his Shatter Spike to actually destroy the greatsword that the Tanaruk was using as a weapon, which is pretty much what Shatter Spike is meant to do. And that made a huge, basically a game-defining difference for them because the 10-orc was now limited to using its claw and bite attacks. So they freed these captive orcs who were there, and we kind of ended the session with the freeing of those orcs. It was at this point as well that one of the female orcs kind of ran or hobbled, I guess, because she was in chains to Goroth, and we kind of faded to black on that session with Goroth holding this female orc and having one of his hands on her belly, basically implying that the chief's wife was pregnant. The party at this point, especially because some of them were new players, were like, oh my goodness, if we didn't come today, or if we had waited one extra day or even a few extra hours, would she have died? And they asked me this, and I just said, yes, absolutely. And it was at this point where they started to realize that time matters. Not in a game mechanic sense where, you know, like it's a resource, because you have infinite time. You can take months to do something basic, and yeah, your characters get older, but mechanically that doesn't really mean anything unless they're 7 years old and at risk of dying of old age. But it has huge implications for a story, and for them to really feel the impact of like, oh man, we were just in time, was pretty cool. And that's one of the reasons why I think tracking time in your game is a good thing to do. I mean, I could do a whole video on that, and I probably will, but yeah, it was a good moment. A good moment where they got to feel heroic. They came out battered, but ultimately didn't lose anyone and managed to save the day, even if it was just by a hair's breadth. So that night there was much rejoicing and, of course, a funeral held for the orcs who had already been killed before they got there. Now this video I know isn't going to be super long like I originally thought it was at the beginning of doing this, but I'm just kind of realizing now that if I continue going with the story, the next campaign diary is going to be like 5 minutes. So I think I will probably end it here for today, and then next week we'll catch up with the last 2 sessions. We'll be all caught up, and then from there going forward, the campaign diaries will just basically be in real time as it happens. So let me know if you're enjoying this series, if you want me to continue doing it, because I actually find it very valuable and like talking about this kind of stuff. What I'm thinking once we get all caught up is I'm going to do 1 campaign diary a month. Basically because at that point, my game runs bi-weekly, so it'll be 1 campaign diary for 2 sessions, and I feel like that makes sense, because otherwise the videos will end up either being really short, or if I do it 2 months, then it will be really long, and you'll have to wait 2 months before getting another campaign diary. So that makes sense to me, but let me know if you have a better solution to that problem. As always, just thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate it, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.